Welcome to SQL Server Analysis Services 115, Key Performance Indicators, or KPIs for short. I'll simply be referring to these as KPIs throughout this presentation. That's just simply how they're known by everyone in the BI industry. So KPIs is a very common term. If you're not familiar with KPIs, let's jump in and talk about, first of all, what are KPIs? Well, KPIs are items in a cube, and they represent the key drivers behind the business. That's why they're called key performance indicators. They are basically the numbers that drive the business. And identifying KPIs is somewhat challenging, but one of the best tricks is to look at executives in the organization and managers and find out what their bonus is based on. When you identify the numbers that they track and look at very carefully, that's how they're driving the business, and those are the key performance indicators. Now, it's a whole separate discussion of what KPIs there are. There are financial, there are ones that map to people, there are ones that map to customers. Some are trailing. Actually, financial indicators are trailing indicators, meaning they occur after the event, and there are some that are leading indicators that help you project what's going to happen in the future. Customer satisfaction is actually a pretty good leading indicator in a lot of cases. So won't get into the discussion really of what all the different types of KPIs there are and how you identify those, but I'll talk about how to create those in the cube, and then we'll go forward from there and actually look at those in the cube. Now, KPIs are similar to measures. Sales is often a KPI as well as just a general measure, but there's some significant differences, and I'll show those to you in a moment. Now, KPIs are generally used for scorecards. That's why they exist. They have a graphical component to them that makes it very easy for an executive or anyone in the organization, but they're usually aimed at executives, make it very easy for someone to glance at it and know immediately how well you're doing. So it's a very quick read on that. It's not just looking at numbers and having to know things. It's just a quick visual indicator. How am I doing? So usually you're talking about scorecarding when you're doing this, whether it's Performance Point Server or some other scorecarding product. It doesn't matter. It's just that KPIs are what go on a scorecard to enable that to work. Now, how do KPIs differ from measures? Well, KPIs consist of four elements or four components, and the first is the value, sometimes also called the actual, and this is just the actual value. It may simply be a measure, it may be a calculation. I'll show you examples of both of those. Then there is the goal, which is the target. This is what the actual value should be. So for example, you have a business and someone says, well, your sales last year were $1 million. Well, is that good or bad? It depends. If your goal was to have $500,000 in sales and you hit $1 million, then that's great. But if your goal was to hit 10 million and you only hit 1 million, that's probably not so good. So we'll talk about this value and goal, and then you have what is called a status, which is how did you do? How was your value compared to your goal? And we'll look at it with a graphical indicator. There are many different graphical indicators, and so I'll show you that. But there's also a formula behind it that determines the state of that graphical indicator. So for example, if you have three colored lights, much like the stoplight that we use here in the US and I know is used in other places in the world, but here it's red, yellow, and green. Red means stop, and green means go, and yellow is caution. And so a lot of times when you're working with KPIs, red is bad, green is good, and yellow is somewhere in the middle. So you have to have a formula that determines when do you switch from green to yellow or yellow to red. And I'll talk about not only choosing that indicator, but then of course creating the formula that flips it from one mode to another. And finally, there's a trend. Now, by the way, you don't have to define a trend. I guess maybe you don't have to define a status, but it wouldn't make much sense not to. But a trend, again, is a graphical indicator, and it shows whether or not the value is trending up, whether it's trending down, or whether it's relatively flat. So it usually is just some indicator showing you are you moving the right direction, because your indicator might be bad, but it might be moving in the proper direction. And by the way, trending up isn't always good. If it's an expense, that's actually bad. So sometimes on your trend, you have to say that decreasing is actually good. So going down means the indicator should be going up because that's improving. So you have to consider all those things when you are creating this as well. Now, KPIs can also be hierarchical. This is very different from a measure. Measures cannot be hierarchical in nature. You cannot create a hierarchy in the measures inside a cube, but with KPIs you certainly can. And KPIs can also be weighted. Because they're hierarchical, they roll up to higher level KPIs, and they may not always be the same weight. And I'll show that to you in the tool here in a moment, but you can then weight those. Now, often you do this kind of work in the scorecarding tool itself, Performance Point Server being the one from Microsoft now. But you can do those in the cube, and again, I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Now, to create and then view these KPIs, you'll go in and create the value, the goal, the status, and the trend calculations using MDX. And I'll show you examples of just dead simple MDX, just pull an existing measure and be done with it. You can do that for the value and the goal. But then the status and the trend are going to be more complex, and the value and goal can be as well. I'll show you examples of that. The status and trend, when you build your calculation, need to return a number between -1 and +1. So 0 is in the middle, -1 is the worst case, +1 is the best case. So you'll build a formula then that returns a value based on whatever your calculation is, returns somewhere between -1 and +1. The indicators, the graphics that you have in analysis services expect 3 positions. So basically -1, 0, and 1. That's not always the case. Some indicators may have 10 positions or 5 positions. There are various ways of doing that. But here you have a fairly simple set of indicators. Okay, graphical indicators is what I mean by that. Also, when you build KPIs in analysis services, you can't use the regular browser. Everything you've been doing so far, you go to the browser window to view it. You can't do that with KPIs. There is a separate KPI browser, and of course I'll show you that here in just a moment. So with that, let's get into BI Dev Studio and take a look. And by the way, I'll be doing all this in BI Dev Studio 2008. It doesn't matter. It's identical in 2005 as well. All the fields, everything is the same, so it doesn't really matter. So let's get into BI Dev Studio. Here I am in BI Dev Studio, and I'm just using the AdventureWorks example and looking at the cube at the moment, and you'll notice that after the Calculations tab there is a KPIs tab. So clicking on that, I'll go in and take a look. Now over on the left hand side I have the KPI organizer, all of the KPIs that exist, and then on the bottom on the left hand side I have calculation tools. I can drag and drop various measures, dimensions. I can take a look at all the MDX functions that are available to me and bring those over and work with those as well. But let's just take a look at the first KPI, and let me unpin the Solution Explorer and the Properties window, get a little bit more room. This is growth in customer base. Notice the first thing, of course, it has a name. That's no surprise. You also have a measure group to which this is associated. So this is associated with internet sales. Remember, for the reseller sales in this example, you don't know who the end customer is. You have resellers, so a growth in reseller base would make sense for reseller sales, growth in customer base for internet sales. Here the value expression is simply an existing measure. Now whether this is a calculated measure that you've created or is a physical measure in the cube doesn't matter here. It just is an existing measure in the cube. It's not a calculation you're building here. Now, that's the actual value, but let's take a look at the goal. In the goal expression, I am saying, okay, what should the goal for this be? Again, this could just be an existing measure. If you've defined your target somewhere else and stored that, it could just be a measure in the cube. But here, They are simply taking a look at the existing data. So what they're doing is saying, okay, if you're looking at the fiscal data, or the fiscal date, if you're at the current member of year, then simply take 0.30. So in other words, year over year, they're expecting a 30% growth. If they are at the fiscal semester, they expect a 15% growth. Fiscal quarter, a 7.5% growth. So basically, they're simply saying what the growth should be at these various levels. And if I scroll on down, then of course at the month, it's it's 2.5%, otherwise NA. So what should that growth be? It depends on what level you are. So that's just a hard-coded value. Okay, it doesn't mean 30%, you notice there's no measure in here. We're just hard-coding in and saying, if you're at the year, it should be 30%, because the measure already is simply a percent growth. Now, the next piece of this, of course, is the status itself. And with the status, you have the ability to choose from several different graphical indicators. Notice you have shapes, traffic lights, road signs, gauges, reversed gauges, thermometers, cylinders, faces, and variance arrows, which we will use for trends in most cases. But here they happen to have chosen road signs. I'll show you what this looks like in just a moment. But with the status, remember that you have to determine when it changes from one state to another. So down here in the status expression, they have defined the case, and notice that this is MDX. You can reference a KPI value and a KPI goal in your MDX expression. So they're simply saying when the value of growth in customer base is greater than or equal to the goal for that, then return a 1. So that is a good indicator. Okay, the green up arrow in this case, the road sign. If the growth in customer base is greater than or equal to 90% and the value is less than the growth in customer base, so we're not better, but we're 90% or more without going over, then we return a 0. So that will be the yellow or middle indicator. Otherwise, we return -1, which is the red or bad indicator. So those are the values there that will determine when we change that graphic from one symbol to another. And finally, you have the trend, which is very similar. Scrolled a little too far there. Here is the trend. Again, I have what should my indicator be: a standard arrow, a status arrow, a reversed status arrow, or faces. I've just chosen a standard arrow here. And I have my expression here. First of all is the case if it's empty, and in here is a parallel period. So what this is saying is the parallel period is the fiscal year, comma 1. So go back 1 year and look at the current member. Whatever I'm using now, look at the same member 1 year ago. That's all it's saying here. And if it's empty, return 0. In other words, it will be a flat trend. And actually, when I first go to view this, that is how it starts, because we're at the all level, and so there is no prior fiscal year from all. So it will be flat and return this 0. So that's why that first calculation is in there. Otherwise, though, assuming that we don't have an empty previous period, then let's take the absolute value. Notice this is a VBA function, and the absolute value. And basically what this is saying is, if I scroll down a little bit here, that, again, we go back to the previous period 1 year ago for the same period, and because this is absolute, okay, they're dividing, and it's 0.02. So if it's 2% plus or minus, in other words, it's very close to the current value, so the growth is almost nil, then we return 0. So we just show that it's flat. We have very little growth, just 2% either way. It's just noise. Now if I continue to scroll down, though, then if it's greater than 2%, so I have more than a 2% variance on that. I shouldn't say growth. My goal was 30%. So if I'm within 2% of that, then it was 0. Otherwise, if I'm more than 2% over that, positive direction, it gets a 1, meaning that the trend is up. Otherwise, it wasn't flat and it wasn't more than 2%. So of course it gets a -1, meaning it will be a downtrend. So this is the definition of one particular KPI. Now there are some additional properties for a KPI, and those include things like a display folder. So this is a customer perspective, and the goal here is to expand the customer base. Again, I'll show you where this comes into play in just a moment. Also, it's asking what is the parent KPI here. There is none, but I will show you an example of that in just a moment as well. I don't have a current time member. I could filter it to a current time member. I don't have a weight. I could, and then there is an optional description here as well. Notice that up here on the toolbar, first of all, here is the item to create a new KPI if you're interested in doing that. And here is the browser. You'll notice that right now we're in the form view. If I go to the browser view for this, it shows here is the growth in customer base. Now again, right now I'm at all time and I haven't done any filtering, so don't worry about the value and the goal here. But here's my status, and then my trend is 1. Notice that it is in the customer perspective folder and the expand customer base folder. Now, before I go back and look at some additional KPIs, I want to point out, I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. Notice here that I have a KPI called net income. And underneath it, I have operating profit, which breaks down into financial gross margin and operating expenses. This is an example of one of those KPIs that are hierarchical in nature. Now, take a look at this. Operating expenses and financial gross margin roll up into operating profit. Right now, the financial gross margin and operating expense both have a green light, so they roll up to something with a green light. Now imagine for a moment that financial gross margin had a green, but operating expenses had a yellow. Should they roll up to a green or a yellow? Well, that depends. Do they weigh the same? Are they both the same importance? That's what that weight is for. You can adjust that weighting to say, well, you know, okay, operating expenses might be yellow, but gross margin is green, and I want gross margin to weigh 5 times what operating expenses does. So it then may roll up into a green, even though one is yellow and one is green. In a similar fashion, if one was green and one was red, would they necessarily roll up into yellow? Not necessarily. They probably would, but again, that depends on the weight that you assign those. So let me go back and let's actually take a look at net income, operating profit, and financial gross profit. I won't go through the full details on all of these, but let's take a look at net income, for example. So I'll drop down to net income, and you'll notice that its value has an expression, which the previous one just pointed to an existing measure. But here what this says is I'm going to point to a measure called amount, but I'm going to use account 47 and scenario 1. Okay, these are just measures, the account measure and the scenario measure. Scenario 1 is actual, and I have other scenarios that are target and so forth. Scenario 2 is actually the budget or target, and account 47 happens to be the account for net income. So you'll notice that my actual is account 47, scenario 1, the measure called amount, whereas the goal is account 47, scenario 2, and the measure called amount. So nothing really surprising there. Now if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see that the status, again, this is using the road sign, the KPI value for net income divided by the KPI goal for net income, if it's greater than or equal to 0.95, so 95%, then I give it a 1. That's a green indicator. Now, that's a business decision. Should it be green if and only if you hit 100% or more? Or in this case, if it hits 95% or more, can it go green? That's a business decision. Someone in the organization will have to make that and tell you what those thresholds are. If the net income value is less than 95% but greater than or equal to 85%, then it's a 0. So that is the yellow, the middle indicator. So 85 to just under 95%, that is a yellow indicator. Anything 95 and over is green, good, and anything else, of course, is -1. It's red. It is the bad indicator. Down here with the trend, that is very similar to what you saw before. Basically, we check for is empty and just make it flat. Otherwise, we come down and look at the difference. And in this case, instead of 2%, it's 3%. So if it's within 3%, if the value is within 3% of the previous value, it's flat. Otherwise, scroll down a little bit here. If it's greater than 3, we give it a 1. Otherwise, we give it a -1. Now again, here we have a display folder, financial perspective, maintain overall margins. Those are just the text that were used to break this down. And this one does not have a parent KPI. Nothing else is defined here, although there is an optional description. So net income, which is right here, there's the maintain overall margins. Under that is operating profit. So if I go back, to operating profit, then you'll notice, okay, very much the same thing here, only this is using account 48 instead of 47, but I use account 48 in scenario 1 for the actual, scenario 2 for the goal or the target. And then if I scroll down here, they've switched indicators. It doesn't matter which indicator you choose. Here they've chosen traffic lights. And again, greater than or equal to 95%, it's green. Less than 95%, but equal to or greater than 85, they're going to return a 0. And otherwise a -1. And the same thing with the status indicator, the same 3% value or variance here. Then there is a parent KPI, which hasn't been set before, but this allows you to choose another KPI, which means that this will then roll up into that KPI. Notice that this is just a little warning thing that it ignores the display folder. If it belongs to a parent, it's going to show up in the same display folder as the parent KPI. So that's just what it's telling you there. Operating profit, of course, there was operating expenses, same thing. Again, just an account and a scenario for both of these. Again, an indicator, a calculation for that, a trend. Notice that this is an expense, so they are using the reversed status arrow. Okay, so that going down is a good thing. Okay, the expenses going down is positive, so they had to use the reversed status arrow here. And then at the bottom here, they pointed the parent KPI to the operating profit. So again, you can then come and take a look at what this looks like here in the browser. Now, this works great in the cube, but now how do you use this elsewhere? And unfortunately, there's not a great answer from Excel. I've come into Excel and I've actually created a connection to this, and I'll clear out what I have here and kind of show you. Here I've connected to this cube in Excel, and notice that when I connect to the cube, I do have my KPIs here. And when I look at these, let me collapse these a little bit. Here's the maintain overall margins. Here's what I was just looking at as an example. And here is the operating expenses, for example. Notice I have the value, goal, status, and trend. So I can select these, and okay, they're not formatted well, but the values are there. And then when I go to status and trend, hey, I actually got some indicators. Not identical to what I had before, but that's great. But now show me the operating profit, and notice it just continues to append columns on to this. You might say, well, okay, just drag those around. Well, if I try to drag these up to the labels, no, I can't do that. I'll drag them over to the rows. No, I can't do that. So it's not ideal for viewing this. If I build my KPIs into the cube, I can certainly reuse them in Performance Point Server. I can also build KPIs in Performance Point Server. I can also reuse these in SharePoint directly without having Performance Point Server, or I can build KPIs there as well. So viewing them is not necessarily ideal, but I did want to go through and talk about how to create these. Creating them in the cube is handy in some cases because I can then reuse them in tools like Performance Point Server, ProClarity, as long as it exists, and potentially other third-party tools as well. So in summary, KPIs are similar to measures. I mean, they are a type of measure in a way, but they do a lot more because they have a value and a goal, an indicator, and potentially a trend. They don't have to have a trend, but they normally do. And these KPIs can be hierarchical. They can roll up into other KPIs, as you just saw. And the elements of a KPI, all that stuff is written in MDX, and you can make those formulas as simple or complex as you want. Obviously, I'm not covering Performance Point Server in this particular video, but just as an FYI, the trends there are just dead simple. It looks at the previous period. If it's up, it gives you an uptrend. If it's down, it gives you a downtrend. It's not very complex at all. Having the ability to write these MDX formulas adds to the complexity of creating these, but gives you tremendous flexibility. And you can do that in Performance Point Server. That's just the default behavior. Normally, you will display these KPIs in some sort of scorecard. Okay, previously, it was Business Scorecard Manager. Now that functionality is found in Performance Point Server. So with that, that is your look at KPIs in Analysis Services 2005 and 2008. Thank you very much.